Hi guys, we've got a short video here today about various aspects of life in colonial America. And these are just kind of random tidbits about what it was actually like to live in the colonies to give you more of a flavor of what was going on the eve of revolution in the British colonies. So the most obvious thing about life in the American colonies was that population on the east coast of America was booming. And this happened for a couple of different reasons. First, immigration from various European countries was going on at an ever-increasing rate. And so this included both people from England, like had been going on since the beginning, but also people from Scotland, Germany, and Switzerland. These people were fleeing various problems in Europe and seeking to start a new life on the east coast of North America. The spread of slavery also helped to increase the population of the British colonies, and by 1775 there were almost 500,000 slaves living in America, mostly in the southern colonies. And last of all, the availability of land and cheap food resulted in a high level of natural population growth. That is, the colonists there were having more children and those children were surviving. And all of this resulted in a spectacular growth of population in the area. It also resulted in the most diverse society on the planet. If you think about any of the countries where these people are coming from, it's mostly people that have one ethnic background and that speak one or two languages. But in the British colonies, you're seeing people from 5 or 6 European countries, from many different African tribes, all coming together and contributing their own experiences and cultural ideas to the colonial culture. And here's a quick graph of just how much the American population grew. In 1700, the population was 250,000, and in 1775, it was 2.5 million. So it increased 10 times in only 75 years, which is really an incredible boom in population. One of the reasons that so many people came from Europe to America was this idea of the American dream. And basically what this meant was that in America you had the opportunity for upward mobility. That is, you could start out life as a poor farmer and end up being a wealthy landowner or merchant or something like that. And this was basically impossible in Europe, because if you started out as a peasant, you were basically doomed to die as a peasant. But in America, land was cheap. You could increase the amount of land you owned and slowly, over the course of your lifetime, become wealthy. This was harder in the South, of course, because most of the land was already owned by huge plantation owners. But it was still possible for hard-working free farmers. Of course, upward mobility was basically impossible for slaves in the South, but for free African Americans it was possible just in the same way that it was for German and Swiss and Scottish immigrants. For most free Americans, life was hard in the colonies, but it was better than back in Europe for a number of reasons. I already mentioned that land and food were both very cheap as compared to Europe. But also, taxes were lower and there were fewer social restrictions. In Europe, even if you did become rich, all the old money people would look down their noses at you and wouldn't really accept you into society. But in America, basically, if you made your way and you established yourself, you would be accepted by the higher ranking people in colonial society. Another interesting thing that made life in the colonies different and unique was transportation was extremely difficult. The roads in colonial America were terrible. People had not been living there very long. Highways and stuff had not really been developed, and most of the roads that did exist were infrequently used, muddy, dusty, bumpy, slow, and did not really connect up with one another in a satisfactory way. That meant that traveling by land was slow and dangerous and unpredictable. Thus, people tended to use water transport whenever possible. And this meant that cities would cluster up mostly around oceans and navigable rivers. What this meant, more or less, was that it was very hard to communicate back and forth between cities, or even for neighbors to communicate with one another. There was a lot of land and not that many people living in America. And this led to distinct colonial cultures. Even though the colonies were pretty close to one another, distance was a much bigger deal back then than it is now. This also led to a mindset that many people consider to be typical for Americans, and that is rugged individualism. It's the idea that you are going to get along by yourself without the help of the community or your neighbors. And this was something that was more or less necessary back in the day in colonial America, because you, more often than not, couldn't even talk to your neighbors, much less ask for them for help, just because they were far away. To demonstrate exactly how big of a problem distance was back then, it took Benjamin Franklin, as he reported it, 9 days to travel from Boston to Philadelphia. Nowadays, this trip would take 4.5 or 5 hours in a car. So distance was a much bigger deal back then. Another interesting aspect of American colonial life was education and literacy. So schooling in America varied a lot from place to place. In New England, public schools were established, and it was actually the first public school system in the world. And this was because New England was densely populated and most people lived in towns, so it was pretty easy to send the kids to a local public school. In the rural South, it was much harder. Most of the children had to work on farms, and nobody lived in towns really, so it was really difficult to gather enough children into a certain area to make education make sense. Thus, most of the people who received any kind of education in the South were taught by private tutors. This was expensive, and it meant that only the rich people really got any kind of education in the South. Something else that was important regarding literacy was the spread of newspapers. Newspapers were the primary way of getting information around in the colonies. And this was because they were cheap and easy to make. All you needed was some paper and a printing press and some ink, and you could create thousands of copies of a particular newspaper and spread it as far as you wanted to. And this was how most people in America figured out what was going on in the wider world. It was also an important source for political ideas and eventually for criticism of British policy. And the thing that established the newspapers as an important source of criticism was the Zanger trial, which happened in New York during the colonial period. And the Zanger trial involved a journalist whose name was Zanger, who published something not nice about the British king. And in response to this, the British governor of New York tried to sue Zanger for sedition, that is, for writing mean things about the government. But there was a trial, and Zanger was actually acquitted, and it was therefore legal from then on to write critical things of the British government, so long as it was actually true. And this set a powerful precedent for freedom of the press that would remain an important idea in American government from then on. So that's just a couple interesting things about how life actually was in the colonies. It's kind of wrapping up our section on colonial America and showing the connections and key differences between regions in the American colonies. There are a couple key terms I'd like you to remember, and we'll talk more about this stuff in class tomorrow.